write something engaging.
My apologies. I forgot to hit the record button earlier. So go ahead.
Yeah, so if you're thinking about you want to write a story, whether it's a true story or whether it's an untrue story, you're in order to be engaging, that's when it falls into the narrative bucket, right? So I don't think it's necessarily even fair to say like, oh, this is the plot structure for fiction, as much as a lot of people misunderstand and they might
Mhm.
say, oh, plot structure is for fiction and then you have nonfiction, but it's not really fiction and nonfiction when we talk about structure. It's about narrative and non-narrative, because the way you structure a non-narrative book, like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, like Today Matters by John Maxwell, they both follow a non-narrative structure where it's more like reading a textbook. And then when you think about something like the story of Martin Luther King's life, or you think of Heartless by Marissa Meyer, those are, one is fiction, one is not, but they both use plot structure. They have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end, they have character arcs. Like, these elements help make the story flow either way.
Mhm. And that's interesting because even I think in writing that is technically non-narrative, maybe a book on business principles or personal finance, getting out of debt, you're still using story. In fact, that was one of the first webinars I did was how to use stories in that kind of fiction. Um, because stories are just engaging and they're great to use to teach a point, to give an example of a point or whatever. But I had a client a little over a year ago and he wanted to write like just sort of a, I don't know what you call it, gosh, sort of like a manifesto, almost like a political treatise or something. And that can happen, like you mentioned a couple of books that are not straight up narrative from front to back. But even then, if you include stories along the way, you're going to get a much bigger readership because most people engage on some level with a story. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. You mentioned that when you list events without a narrative flow, it ends up reading like a textbook, kind of hard to read, dry, and it's also missing the point. What do you mean by it's missing the point?
Yeah, most of the time when we write a story, whether we write a book or we write fiction, typically we're trying to convey a message, right? I was, kind of coaching with someone who they had a kind of difficult childhood. I think we all could find
Mhm.
ways to talk about that, but some have been harder than others. And we were just talking through it, and he had really some crazy stories, like individual chapters that were really good. But when you looked at it like chapter to chapter, there wasn't really any connection aside from him getting older. And so then what I was talking to him about is like, hey, why do you want people to read this book? It's not, you know, no one on this call is Martin Luther King. No one on this call is Abraham Lincoln. This call is, someone that the whole world cares about every detail of your
Right,
life. So if any of us were to try to write our stories, we would typically do it not necessarily to convey all the details of what happened in our life, but
right.
because we want to get across a theme. Maybe we want to, I had someone at my house last week who's really interested in writing a book because she dealt with an abusive husband and had to stayed in that for 10 years, and then she finally got out. And as we were talking, I was like, so really your theme is about kind of finding your value even in an environment like that, and to break out of that. And she's like, yeah, I want to empower other women. And so that right there, that's her theme. That's the point. The
Mhm.
point isn't to talk about every terrible thing her husband did to her and
Right.
complain about that for an entire book. The point is to talk about how she found the strength within herself to break out of that, to empower other women to break out of a similar environment. And so when we think about sitting down to write a book, usually we are writing this story because we want to convey a message. We want to convey a theme, whether it's about the power of responsibility or the importance of, working hard, or, overcoming childhood sexual abuse, or whatever that theme is.
Mhm.
That's the point. And when we use narrative structure to tell that story in a way that is engaging, it helps us convey that message. Because if we just list out everything that happened, we don't really get to see and feel that transformation. And so that message isn't conveyed to the reader.
Right. No. Yeah.
Getting dark, and so I'm gonna have to kind of
Um,
the
yeah.
sun,
What's that?
the sun went away.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I actually do talk about that with my clients. You know, if you're writing about your story, you're not writing a biography. Like you mentioned, if you're not a historical figure, if you're not Abraham Lincoln, if you're not, I don't know, Madonna, a celebrity or somebody really important, most people don't care about all the ins and outs of everything that's happened, even during a certain time period of your life. Most people who are not famous, if you're going to write something, you're going to write a memoir, not a biography. And that is always trying to convey a point. And, you and I talked about sometimes people can get caught, well, but, I want to make sure it's true. I want to make sure it's accurate. And that's totally fine. But there's ways to get around that. And I think we're going to get that.
Yeah, if we look at the Gospel of John, which is really the template used in my book, right? Well, John's pretty frank at the end of chapter 20. He says, hey, I didn't write everything in this book. I left out a lot. Other things happened. But then he says, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. His point wasn't to convey every detail of Jesus's life.
Right.
And he doesn't really put Jesus's life in the same order as the other gospels, because John wasn't setting out to really tell us the story of Jesus. He was setting out to explain and show how and why we should believe in Jesus. So he doesn't lie. He doesn't make up stories. There aren't things that didn't happen put into John. But when we look at John, we see that he left out a lot of miracles. Like all the other gospels put at least 20 miracles. He only includes 7, right? He really focused more on the big picture of why we should believe that Jesus is the Son of God, instead of caring about, you look at Luke reads much more like a textbook, very much more like everything that happened in the order that it happened. And then while that was happening, this person came, and that's fine. It's just got a different purpose. The purpose of John was to convey the theme of believing in Jesus. And so he's not lying. He's not telling an untruth by leaving out those other details that didn't serve his theme.
Right. Yeah. And so you mentioned also story structure. So tell us a little bit about what is story structure, because that's kind of the whole reason we're here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different story structures out there. A lot of people believe Aristotle was the first one to identify structure with his 3-act structure, but there have been different people that have said, oh, we've noticed this. Pretty much any story structure book out there is basically saying, hey, I've read a lot of things and I've noticed they all have these common elements. And in my book, actually in the appendix, I break down different story structures and how similar they are and where the differences are. They all have a beginning. They all have kind of a status quo world of where the main character starts. They all have that inciting incident or story spark or catalyst, whatever it is that pushes the main character out of that beginning place. They all kind of have a rising action or an increasing of threats as they move toward a midpoint moment, which usually has a twist, but there's always some sort of like raise the stakes moment in all plot structures that happens in the middle, the midpoint. And then they all have that climactic ending, climax, finale, whatever term. And most of them have the falling action, the what happens after. The only books that really don't are tragedies. They a lot of times will end at the climax. But outside of that, you tend to have kind of some falling action, tying up the loose ends. And so story structure, whether like in my book, I follow Save the Cat Writes a Novel. So I use the story structure from Blake Snyder. But whether you use that, whether you use the 3-act structure, whether you use the hero's journey, they all tend to have these same major beats. Because at the end of the day, that's just a good story. A good story
Right.
has a character, you introduce them, and then something happens to them, and that sends them on a journey, and then there's a climax. Like, that's just a consistency in story. And when we look at our own lives, if we're trying to tell a story of a small piece of our lives, like, I don't know how many people in this call actually know me, but like, I went through a situation where I lost both my parents 13 days apart, right? If I were to try to tell that story, then there's like this client, there's this thing that happened. Dad was in a car accident, right? And then probably I'd put my mom's pulmonary embolism as like the midpoint, like another twist. Like, we were finally getting things figured out and everything's now going in a new direction. And probably like my big finale might be when I had the opportunity to give a speech and really talk to people about like what had gone on inside of me over that time, right? And so at the end of the day, I would have to kind of move those plot points around based on the theme that I'm trying to convey. If my theme is about overcoming tragedy, like maybe those might both be at the inciting incident, and the closing or finale might be when I had reached more of a healing place. About a year after they died, I spoke at a women's conference, right? And so I might adjust the timeline. On the other hand, if I wanted to talk about like how to share your faith in a dark season, the finale might be more about when I was, speaking on the news right after my parents died, and really getting to share the gospel in a lot of environments I wouldn't have had that opportunity either. So the details of what happened in my life, they're not going to change. But based on the theme I'm trying to convey with the story, I might move around where the plot points fall on the story.
Right. And you can do that, by the way. One of the best books that I've read that does that really well is and this is very relevant to what's to current events. It's called Son of Hamas, and it's the story, true life story of one of the oldest sons of one of the 5 founders of Hamas. And he did write with a ghostwriter, but who helped him a lot. But you have these like flash forwards and flashbacks and things like that, so the theme advances in a logical way for the theme, but the timeline is not always straightforward. And it's not confusing. Again, you see it all the time in TV shows and movies where you've got flashbacks, flash forwards, dreams where you have memories or whatever. So there's ways to adjust the timeline without being inaccurate. I noticed that you're differentiating between story and plot. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so when we think about, sometimes the word story is used interchange, to be clear. But when I write about it, I try to differentiate them carefully, because I tend to talk about plot. I talk about like the details of exactly what happened on the outside. And when I talk about story, I tend to talk about what happens inside. So the like catchphrase, I guess, is like plot happens to our characters, story happens inside our characters, right? And so when you have these two running in parallel, it makes for a more gripping and meaningful and effective story. Last night, again in class, we were dissecting different stories and about like, how are some books like, oh, that was interesting, and then you put it down and walk away, and other books are like, this is so good, I want to go back to it again and again. And so often it's because of their incorporation of theme. And so if we look at the story of Frodo trying to take the ring to Mordor, right? Like, yes, it is the story of the little guy going against the big guy and trying to destroy this ring, but it's also a story of friendship, and it's a story of working through things together. And there's that internal story that's happening in addition to the plot, the actual like fight. The same thing we see with Aragorn and his, yes, he is moving toward taking his role as king, but he's also internally willing to set aside the freedom he got from going as Strider, and he's taking on the mantle of being the heir that he has kind of been unwilling to before Carrie.
Right. And you see that in every story, nonfiction or fiction. I mean, whether it's somebody, whose inciting incident might be, or catalyst might be, a diagnosis of a very aggressive cancer, or you know, a fantasy story where the inciting incident might be, you know, this teenage kid finds a dragon egg. Um,
I will say it's in every story that's a good story. Like
yeah,
every good, gripping, powerful, effective narrative is going to have theme.
right.
There's obviously a lot of books out there that don't incorporate theme, and they're just kind of like a series of fun events. And when you don't have that internal character arc,
Mhm.
you just kind of have static characters going through the motions of an event. It's just not as gripping or as powerful.
Mhm. Yeah. No, and but anyway, I think for most of people who are on this call who are probably nonfiction authors, or are looking to write nonfiction, uh, you're definitely going to have some sort of theme, something inside you that's happening while the exterior stuff is also happening. Um, so tell us how. Um, and we've kind of covered this a little bit, but if anybody's looking back over the episodes or incidents in their life, for example, I'm ghostwriting a wonderful story right now, and it's the parents of a neurodivergent child who he did not get a proper diagnosis till his late teens, and I just finished drafting the midpoint of their story last week when they, you know, he's 17 and they've been going through this, what started out as kind of inconveniences or kind of weird funny things in their child's behavior that ended up becoming very scary and very nightmarish. And then they finally get that diagnosis, and hooray, you know, that's kind of the midpoint. Now we know what's wrong. Now, it wasn't the finale because they had to work through a heck of a lot more before they were able to repair the relationship with him, you know, and before things kind of went back to normal for the, well, not normal, but you know what I'm saying. um, anyway, so for the audience, of course, if you want more about plot structure, um, pick up a copy of Jenn's book. But Jenn, tell us how you could use this narrative structure you've been talking about to write my story, your story.
Yeah, I think the first step, like when you're writing fiction, the first step is to build your world and identify your characters and kind of get a feel for where you're going, right? When you're writing a true story, you don't need to build a world and you don't need to make up characters. There's still a little bit of like documenting those things. But the first real step, if you're trying to write narrative nonfiction, is to start with like listing out what happened, right? And so understanding, you know, what are all the events that took place and documenting the dates. And maybe you have journals that you can go back over that. Maybe you just build a giant spreadsheet. It doesn't necessarily need to be like full scenes, but just like sentences of like, oh, this happened, this happened, this happened. And I would say in the beginning, not to worry about whether or not it ties back to theme. I would say just in the beginning, getting all of those events documented.
Mhm.
So then you could go, figure out like this is the timeline of events, right?
Mhm.
After you have that, after you know like these are all the things that happened in that season, then you can go and look at a plot structure and you can go, okay, which one of these would be the catalyst? What really
Mhm.
sparks this story? Which of these events would be a good example of a midpoint? Like where does the story tend to turn in a direction? Like you can start to kind of map those things. And sometimes you might get all your stuff out in a timeline where you're like, this is the order of the things that happen. And you might go, hey, in order for story structure to work, we're going to have to use some flashbacks. We're going to have to use some, flash forwards, that kind of thing
Mhm.
to make the structure flow in a way that makes sense. Maybe 90% of your story happens in the present, but there's really, really important events that happened way in the past. And so using some flashbacks in that, or whatever. And that's where, if you've never done this before, it's good to work with someone like you. But it starts, like I said, with just listing out all the events that happened. Skipping that step a lot of times will lead to just struggling through the plotting
Right.
process. The hard part about that is then you want to take everything in that list and put it in the story. And sometimes it just doesn't fit,
Mhm.
right? Like if John had documented every single miracle Jesus did, he says the world could not contain the books that would be written, right? And so we're thankful that he condensed it down to chapters.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, no, and you know, you mentioned the first step is to write out everything that happened. And there's definitely I one of my clients had done kind of that. They did what you said. They made a spreadsheet and they kind of listed like, you know, the years across the top, and then sort of like what their family was doing, what age and grade their son was for each of those years, and then, you know, kind of the events. And you're absolutely right. Even some events that were relevant to the theme, we're cutting out just because, again, like you say, you don't want to just drag on and on and on and on. So what I encourage when I work with clients, what we do is the first thing we do is I'm like, okay, I know you just want to start writing, but first we're going to take a big step back and we're going to talk about what are your goals? What should your reader think when they finish this book? What should they feel when they finish this book? What advice or life lesson or inspiration should they take away from this book? And we start from there. Sometimes people can't make a list right away, you know. It's hard. And so, you know, I encourage them, let's try some free writing exercise where you just kind of pick a topic or a time period and you just write till stuff starts, you know, shaking loose. You know, that writing helps you get things out of your mind you didn't even realize were there or forgotten were there. So sometimes there may be some creative exercises that need to happen first before you actually get to the list. But yes, the list is kind of the main starting point. And then you separate from the life events, you talk about things that have to do with the theme. And whoops, I just lost my place.
Yeah, once you have that list, once you
Mhm.
set for all the things that happened, then the second step would be to sit down and go, okay, whatever my theme is,
Mhm.
my cat is wanting to be on this call apparently. Whatever that theme is, like where are those turning points internally? Where, you know, and again, these could be separate events, they could be moments in existing events, but like, for example, if your theme is, you know, learning to do your own thing instead of following what everyone else wants, there's probably thematically moments where you didn't do what you wanted to do because you were conforming. And so then maybe marking those like, oh, these really point to the theme. And then there are probably thematic moments where there was conflict, like strong conflict between what you wanted to do and what you were being told you should do. Maybe your parents want you to be a doctor and you want to be an artist, right? And so those would be like, oh, these are thematic moments. They're also event moments. Things are also happening on the outside. But those are those moments where you're starting to see friction between what you want to do and what you're being told you should do. And then there's probably that first time that you do your own thing. And then there's probably repercussions from that. And all of those kind of play into the theme. And then there's that final big way that you announce, like, I'm going to do my own way. I'm going to go to art school. I'm going to whatever it is. And so, yes, these are events in the plot. But those are going to be the ones you kind of highlight, whether you highlight them in another color, if you're doing it on paper, whether you kind of mark them in yellow, if you're doing them on the computer. You say these are the thematic moments, because as you're mapping your outline, you also want to map your arc, your
Right.
character of that theme to the structure. Now, this is what we had kind of talked about when we were preparing for this. Sometimes, because our lives don't follow perfect 3x structure, they follow the realities of life. Sometimes you have to be a little creative about timelines. Like maybe midpoint in your plot falls, you know, on Saturday night, and maybe the big thematic internal decision that belongs at the midpoint happens a couple of days later, but you just have to structure it in a way when you're writing where you can kind of bring those two things together. Right. So that's where, again, if you don't have an outline, you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, it might not happen naturally. But if you're following kind of some rough structure, it's going to help you identify like, oh, this is my emotional midpoint, thematic midpoint, and this is my, like, this is when there's a turning point in the confrontation with my parents, and like, how do we connect these two things? Yeah,
no, and I think you call the external plot structure the A story an internal, the B story. And I also want to say this, that sometimes this sounds a little more complicated than it actually is. A lot of times this can become intuitive. Especially if you just, whether you're the kind of person that, like you say, sits down and writes out a 20-page outline to start with, which sounds exhausting, or whether you're the kind of person that just sits and writes and you come back later and rearrange. It's sometimes when you get into the very technical aspects of what's happening, it sounds like a lot, but it's really not.
Well, and I think it's one of those things that the more you read, the
Mhm.
better you're going to be as a writer. And the more you write, the better you're going to be as a writer.
Right.
But if we look at it, whether you're trying to write a 1-paragraph long story, as an example, in a non-narrative nonfiction, or whether you're trying to write a full 3-act structure across 3 different books, you're still going to have a beginning. You're going to have an inciting situation. You're going to have some sort of twist, and then you're going to have a conclusion. And in fact, even when I was teaching sellers, like I worked for a sales company, and when I'm teaching sellers, I'm like, you have, if you're trying to build a success story, it's like, what was the situation at my client? Sentence 1. What did we do? That's the twist. Like, we installed this software. And then sentence 3 is, and here was the outcome. So when we think about it, story structure really is just that. Now, the longer a book is, the more valuable and necessary structure is, so that people don't get lost. Because if you have 3 plot points in a 500-page book, people are going to be super bored, right? But ultimately, it is one of those things that you learn the rules so you can break the rules. John breaks the rules. I talk about it. He takes like 4 chapters off from his plot structure to recount everything Jesus said on the last night before he died. Well, that just destroys pacing, right? But again, you learn the rules so you can break the rules, because he knew that his audience would really need to understand the things that Jesus thought were the most important to say right before he died. And so they're similar to John Galt's 90-page essay in the middle of Ayn Rand's, what is that book called? Atlas Shrugged. There's this 90-page essay that just destroys pacing, right? He's just talking for 90 pages. But the rest of it has a structural flow. And so, again, I'm not saying you need to have a random essay break in the middle of your book, but if you understand the structure, then you create enough tension leading into that, enough tension afterwards, like you can work around it. So it's not like, plot structure isn't meant to be some sort of like, you've got to check all the boxes or else you fail. Plot structure, I call it a lot of times in the book, guardrails and guidelines, right? Like, here's the super highway, and as you write your story, you're going to figure out when you need to take the off roads. When do you need to take a pit stop? When do you need your story to kind of meander a little outside? But the plot structure is kind of that. This is the way most stories are going to flow. And so you should get back to the highway at some point. You should hit your midpoint. There are certain things that if they're not there, your story kind of struggles to, especially midpoint, your story will struggle and kind of sag in the middle if there's not some sort of anchoring event in the middle, unless it's a short story, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a term that's used in the writer's world. I think Stephen King was the first to use it, or the one who came up with it, killing your darlings.
I don't know who created that. Killing your darlings is a little bit of a different thing, but that's kind of like when you sit down and you write this scene and it's just the perfect scene, and then it just doesn't fit in your structure. And being willing to do that. I also talk about that in my book and the chapter on epilogues. One of my favorite authors is Marissa Myers, and she takes her favorite darling, her favorite chapter that didn't fit in the rest of the story, and she puts it after the end, kind of as an epilogue, except it's not really an epilogue because it's a random from the middle that didn't fit in the story structure. I just think that's really fun. But yes, there are going to be scenes that are just like, oh, this is such a chef's kiss perfect scene, but it doesn't work in the pacing. And that's where you kind of don't delete it, just put it in a separate file, and maybe it can be in the bonus material on the, you know.
That's what I do. And with my ghostwriting projects, I always have a document that I call unused paragraphs. And it's when we cut out a paragraph or even maybe a whole page or two, it's like, well, this is good, but the cool thing when you're writing nonfiction, most people, and I'm sure you do, you've got a website as an author website. And for some people, they have a page for blogging. And so some of those things that you cut from your book can be the stubs of really great blog posts, or if you're a podcaster or whatever, or you're on social media, that can make great content to help you market your book when you cut those. But anyway, well, I think that about wraps it up. Jenn, thank you so much for being here. Alex or Lauren, do either of y'all have any questions that y'all would like? And I know, Lauren, you've got a baby, so you may not be able to speak out. Alex, not right now, but this was great. Awesome. And one of you, Alex or Lauren, one of you, okay, well, Alex can't really chat either. She's at work. Got it. One of you will be winning a copy of Jenn's book. So I will get with you hopefully this Friday and let you know which one of you won that. So thanks. Anything else, Jenn?
No, you guys can find me on Amazon. There's a book and then there's a companion journal. I really like the journal. What I love about the journal is that the lines themselves are made out of the actual words of the gospel. But the journal goes along with each day's reading. So there's a place for you to kind of like highlight on the scripture from that day's reading. There's some of the questions and thoughts from the chapter, and then there's adult coloring pages for each of the days. I have a friend that's just how she engages with scripture, so I decided to include that. And so both of those are available on Amazon. Writing Your Story with God is my book, and then Journaling Through John is the companion journal.
And I am actually I'm dropping the link, the Amazon link. Here we go. Here's the link to the book in the oh wow, Lauren says that she's been looking at doing the same thing, Jenn, connecting writing to the gospel. So that's awesome.
Yeah. I designed this to be a Bible study, that could go through NaNoWriMo, like I said, but I just wanted to stay more connected to God while writing, yeah. So anyway,
there is the link, and I will also send that with the replay. I'll send the link to your book around. So anyway, yes, so key, especially as a believer. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Jenn. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Alex, for being here. And I will be reaching out to you guys soon. Have a wonderful.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Have a wonderful rest of your day.